Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Macro Micro Moment, again with my partner, Arthur Laffer. We are coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee, Arthur, and Scottsdale, Arizona. As we go throughout the program, if you have any questions about the firm, you can go to our website, laffertengler.com. You can pull down our commentaries and you can reach out to us individually. But first and foremost, we're going to go around the world with Arthur.
Jane, get me off this crazy ride. I think that's somebody made an axe murder, Mike Myers. Anyway, so I think we're talking about going around the world, but obviously there's a lot of moving parts to this world we have right now. I think one of the most forefront issues that it's on the screen is the tariffs and the threat of tariffs. It seems like there's been a lot of threats of tariffs being thrown around. They get suspended. They get restarted. There was a recent clip I saw where Trudeau was talking about tariffs and how destructive they are, or they would impose them on us. And then Trump came out and said Canada imposes like 300% tariffs on U.S. dairy products, which, by the way, is factually true. So Canada protects its dairy industry a lot. But right now, the two big ones, and the reason they're the biggest, Nancy, is Canada and Mexico are two of the three biggest trading partners we have. Right. But we run big trade deficits with them. So you got to figure out which shoe's on which foot, and you're thinking about like, okay, so who's going to threaten the most? We have a bigger stick to swing in this fight. These guys are much more dependent upon exports to us than we are to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the major thing we would miss is avocados, and you wouldn't miss that at all.
I wouldn't eat that at all.
No, the only person I know that doesn't eat avocados.
But Arthur, native Californian too.
Yeah. Don't you think too? I mean, I think instructive to most Americans was the discussion around how much the Germans tax our cars versus how much we tax theirs. So our tax is 2.5% for a German import. They tax us 10% plus the VAT. So it ends up being close to almost 30% or high 20s anyway. And I think that is the purpose, don't you? I mean, the reciprocal tariffs seem to me to be pretty potentially benign if they do what the president, I think, is looking for them to do. But I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, and I think there's actually kind of two main points with regard to tariffs. I'm going to start by saying tariffs in general are bad. What they do is they increase prices. There's no evidence to the contrary. Tariffs are bad. They make prices higher for producer consumers. So they raise prices for sure. The only time I could think of that you would really have a good argument for tariffs on a specific good or industry would be a matter of national defense. Like you're trying to protect yourself. Like you could make a case about the chips with AI in China. I could make that case. But outside of that, all it does is raise the price of goods and services, right? So first and foremost, that's, outside of national security, you want to have really the lowest tariff rates you can across the board. And I think that really is ultimately what we're talking about here with Trump. We get the short end of the stick. We're the biggest trade partner in the world. I think we have about $3 trillion in total trade that the U.S. produces out of $25 trillion globally. Places like Canada and Mexico, and it disproportionately export much more to us than we export to them, especially if you take into account GDP.
For clarification purposes, the reason we export less is that we consume more of our own goods, correct?
And also because it's harder for us to export some of our products in other countries, like my example on dairy. But Japan doesn't like our agricultural products. A lot of times it's agriculture, or it's a local industry that the country's trying to protect. Like in case of Germany, autos. I don't know why they're so focused on protecting the auto industry. I mean, other than it's a big industry, but they've overprotected it, and it makes it weaker, just like autos were in the U.S. back in the 70s.
Well, and just as a small digression, I mean, I think that was one of the things that RFK Jr. was talking about, like the difference between a McDonald's fry and what goes into that, which sounds really good this time of day, but what goes into that versus the same package of fries in England. And ours contain more chemicals. And I think that is one of the reasons that we see such a protectionist attitude. So if that's cleared up, I wonder if the tariffs will clear up at all, separate from whatever President Trump is proposing.
Well, and it's funny, Nancy. The first threat was against Canada and Mexico, but it was really a fentanyl and border protection issue. So those
Right.
are two real borders, right? So it's clear that that was an easy one for them to go along with because it really wasn't a tit for tat trade issue. It was really a hey, this is a national security issue. They backed off very quickly, which is what they should have done. Now we're into the second round of these countries. I think disproportionately have higher taxes. They protected some of their industries more than ours. We like more free trade. In fact, I think wasn't it the last time we had our show that I talked about how I think originally in Trump's first term he had talked about this issue with Trudeau back then and said, hey, like let's get rid of all tariffs between our two countries. Let's go 100% free trade. And Trudeau backed down. Why? Because we probably would have eaten their lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's going to happen anyway. It's just happily got delayed for a time. But so what then do you think in terms of our global trading status? Do you think do you think the reciprocal trades are going to work and incentivize our trading partners to lower tariffs on us? And therefore, these tariffs would become not inflationary, but deflationary.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually what's going on here is to get the overall rate of tariffs across the board down effectively. Obviously, we're using our economy as the way to try to get these countries to come to the table and talk
Right.
about lowering their tariffs on our goods, our exporters, right? Especially if we're trying to onshore, because one of the things we're going to want to do is we're building more manufacturing and stuff and re-onshoring here in the US. One of the markets we're going to want to make sure those manufacturers can go and access are obviously overseas, not just domestically. Lower tariffs is going to help make a much more level playing field.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the news today that Apple announced, which is 500, they're going to spend $500 billion and hire 20,000 people over the next 5 years to bring manufacturing, to avoid tariffs and bring manufacturing and the supply chain back to the US. So I don't know if this is pandering to the Trump administration. Like, if I do this, please don't, I don't know, accelerate tariffs on my products, the iPhone coming back to the US. But I suspect it is. But it was nonetheless, it was a very politically astute move by Tim Cook. Uh,
It's interesting, Nancy, is when I start thinking about tariffs, I think of that great my dad. I don't know how many bazillions of times I've heard this, and I'm sure you had too. It's the irony is that, if you find a store selling you high quality, low price goods, is your first thought to boycott that store. And I'm like going, yeah, that's right. That's what a tariff is. It's like you're trying to punish that producer for giving you a high quality, low cost product. It's like, oh, can't do that.
no, 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 that's not in the best interest of the globalists.
No.
Okay, well then let's shift a little bit to the elections in Germany. One of the questions I want to ask you after you tell us what happened and what's going to happen is why is the European stock market outperforming? Is there a fundamental reason or is it just a shift by the hedge funds? But that's a preview. So I'm setting you up after you tell us about the election. Because I think it's fascinating. So go.
It is, and I think the thing that's really fascinating too, or something that people should be paying attention to here, is the shift across the board to the right. Germany is just the latest election to shift to the right. If you look at the chart on the screen right now, you'll see the largest bar is the black one. That's the Christian Democrats, CDU, CSU. It's a Bavarians or the CSU. And then the second biggest bar is that blue one, and that's the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. They're considered the far right, although their chancellor candidate, if you looked at their policy profile and stuff, Nancy, you wouldn't think that this was an extremist group. Although I'm not going to discount the people in that, there are some people in that group that sound pretty extremist, but the party overall actually seems like just a fairly conservative, right-leaning party. You would think these two would naturally have things in common, and they should. But because the AfD has been branded like Le Pen's party in France as extreme far right, no one's willing to play ball with them or let them actually come in and actually help rule and pass laws. But yet you've got 1 in 5 plus Germans voting for the party.
Wow.
very
And the
dangerous
and the
to any
CDU is
country.
conservative, right? The CDU is well,
CDU is kind of, I'd say, more center right. They're
yeah,
conservative, yeah, and
okay,
the AFD is probably more right. They're anti-immigration, they're more like UKIP used to be, Nigel Farage's party, Reform Now.
okay,
Again, so you're seeing these parties pop up all over Europe, and they're getting very large constituencies, disenfranchising 1 in 5 Germans. I mean, do it at your own risk. Any
yeah,
country should be careful about doing that.
yeah, and so then the smaller, the dribs and drabs, what happens to those now that the election has
Yeah,
taken place?
so Germany has, like some countries do, but Germany specifically has a 5% federal threshold. So if you don't clear 5% of the popular vote, for the most part, you don't get representation in the Bundestag. So if you look at the SPD, which is a shame because they're more like our libertarians. They're pro, they're pro growth, low tax, deregulation. That's the party that the FDP represents their policies. They're out, they're gone. So they're going to have no federal representation now. They're going to have to try to climb back out of the pit next time to try to get more than 5%. So they get seats in
Okay.
the Bundestag. Same thing with the BSW and these others. There's actually a party called the Pirate Party in Germany, by the way. Seriously.
Arg.
But they gotta balance up. So think about a 15% increase in those numbers is really what you're looking at with regard to representation in the Bundestag.
To the big ones, to the big
Yeah.
number. Yeah,
And
interesting.
interesting also, Nancy, I don't know if you've seen this. I think we were talking about this earlier, but Merz, who is the chancellor candidate for the CDU, right? That's the majority party now.
Okay,
He's got to put together a coalition. If he won't do the AFD, which would put them over 50%, and they wouldn't need to add anybody else, but he ain't going to do that. So now the question is, he's got to go in and cut a deal with the SPDs, which just got hammered, and probably the Greens to put together a government that has 50% so they can rule. It's
holy
always lowest
moly.
common denominator. Like you always
Oh
get.
my gosh.
Yeah,
So the AFD just sits out there. They have representation, but they don't have any power.
yep,
Yeah, okay.
yep,
Wow, talk about dysfunctional,
yeah.
uh, government. So what do you think? I mean, well, first of all, I think, I didn't get his name, but the effective leader, of
Merz.
government, Merz?
Yeah, MERZ. Yep.
MERZ, okay. So he's been taking a pretty hard stance as it relates to, President Trump, has he not?
Yep. In fact, I think that's kind of the question. Like, what does this all mean? I'm like, why do we care other than it's interesting? Politics is always interesting, like making sausage, right? You never want to really find out how it's done, but everybody's got a dog in the fight. I think the issue is really the economy of Europe. Germany is the largest economic power in Europe. It's also considered the most stable country in all of Europe as well. So, kind of what happens in Germany really affects the overall economy and stock markets, bond yields, you name it. A hung government or a government that's got to compromise. The SPD and the CDU are not aligned in some areas like tax cuts or border protection. Um, the platforms are pretty different. And the head of the SPD, Olaf Scholz, got knocked out, so he's gone. They've got a new person who's in charge of the party. So again, what kind of
Interesting.
concessions is Merz going to have to put in place to get an actual government, a majority government going? It's
So
not clear.
it makes it unlikely that they're gonna see, pro-growth policies that would drive the fundamentals of the stock market. I think that's why I sense that this is a trade that we're seeing right now. The European markets and global markets in general, but especially the European markets, have rarely in the last 25 years been able to string together, a couple of quarters of outperformance relative to the US. So would you agree with that, or do you think that
Yeah, yeah. I
okay.
mean, I think these elections they're not clearing out the system. They're not getting enough of a coalition that agrees up front with which direction to go with, and you're just basically looking at negotiating on the margin. Unfortunately, the SPD and the SPD and the Greens, their policy platforms are very different. They have very different objectives. So how do you get these three parties to get together and actually get some semblance of good policies?
Okay.
I think that's the problem, and that's the problem in
Yeah.
France too, and Spain and Portugal. Um, and what's Germany going to do? Like, we could pick up a base and move it to Poland. Poland would take our base, NATO, U.S. bases every day of the week. They already
Oh,
are.
what a
We're
great
already
point.
expanding this.
Yeah, what a great point. And
Big
then
deal.
maybe the UK is next.
Oh, if you look at the reform under Nigel Farage, they're now the number one most popular party in the UK. I mean, Starmer's not looking real good the next time elections come up.
It's nuts. I
Yep.
tell you. I mean, they just don't listen to the people. So that's why you get these radical dislocations that then create other problems, right? But
What's also
well,
interesting, Nancy, is get the European Union, right? And you're talking about trade. So you've got one person in the US who's got huge amount of economic power, right? And Trump can say and do whatever he wants. And it's one person with one voice. And Merz can come out and talk about anything he wants, but they got to get consensus, even in Europe, about tariffs. It's like herding cats. It's really hard to build consensus because everybody has their own special interests. And
right,
so what the EU doesn't have that we do have is we got like one voice saying, Germany, you better lower your taxes. And France is like, yeah, don't get him mad. He just don't make him look at us. I think I saw an article about Maloney's like keeping a really low profile. And she's like, keep her head down because Trump's going to turn his eyes to you and you're next, because he can separate them and they can't separate us, which is a
right.
huge advantage for the US.
Huge advantage.
Huge
Yep.
advantage.
And I think even at Davos, my not favorite event of the year, one of the CEOs was talking about the regulatory burden that the EU imposes and how they can't grow their economy, which is why I don't think this rally is sustainable, but they can't grow their economy because of the regulatory burden. And we're in the process of moving in the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
can I just ask you a question or two about Doge and what you think about the whole thing? Because I just am finding it, having spent my whole career in the private sector, where if you asked everyone to put their head down and raise their hand if they've ever been laid off, I think pretty much everyone would raise their hand and had that experience of either, a recession and they cut jobs and you were last in, or what a disagreement with a superior. But the fact is that it's a cruel world, and it's incumbent on people to perform. I thought this latest email over the weekend where Elon sent it out and said, "Tell us 5 things you did last week," and everyone's been wringing their hands. Oh, I can't believe he asked that question. And Trump comes out and says, "I thought it was brilliant." I mean, what do you think about all this cost cutting? Do you think it will be meaningful? Do you think that they will be able to move forward with you know eliminating jobs as quickly as it seems they are? Or tell me, because you have a connection to DC that none of us have.
I mean, this stuff's getting pretty in the weeds as to what they can and can't do legally. I mean, that stuff I don't know, but I mean, when you start hearing, actually, Nancy, you've told me these stories about, Chip being in the Navy and the issues around technology and upgrades, and government's very slow to change. Government is just really inefficient, just as a rule. You look at the upgrade of the IRS, I think, computer systems, right? And it took forever, and it was way over budget, and the damn thing still didn't work. That's
Right.
pretty typical. I mean, who's
Or
been
the
to the
Obamacare
DMV?
website. Wasn't that like $360 million? And I was like, why don't we just give a check to everybody who doesn't have health
That's
care?
yeah.
And that would be cheaper. Yeah, I think when Sean Duffy, the transportation secretary, came out and said they're still using floppy disks at the FAA, that to me was just kind of, I mean, there's a whole generation of people in the workforce that don't even know what a floppy disk is.
I didn't know
So
you could buy them. I mean, where do you buy floppy disks? That's insane. That's in. Or you and I were talking about how if you want to retire from the government, you have to fill all the paperwork out, and they take it down a salt mine, or what was it, Nancy? You
no,
have to take
no,
it by
that's
elevator.
That's Social Security. Not that I would know personally, but I have a friend who applied for Social Security, and it took 3 months and multiple. You apply online apparently, and then they have somebody call you, and then they tell, "Oh no, you should do this," and then they disappear for a month. Well, then we learn that none of them Social Security people are working in the office,
Yeah.
and then we learn that they can only process 10,000 applications a month because they have to get them down the shaft into the limestone mine. So this particular person took 3 months to receive Social Security, and the most interesting part to me was after you fill the thing out online and you say, "I attest that," you check a box says, "I attest this is true." They call you up and say, "Is this true?" what you put on your applications. So it's just make work and so stupid.
Yeah.
So I'm 100% there. But let's take a break and we'll come back and unless do you have more you want to say
No,
about tariffs?
I was actually gonna do a lead in for you, be honest with you.
Oh, okay. Well, you
Sometimes
can
I'm
do it
clever enough I can do that. I was gonna
right.
say, it's interesting, you talk about the Doge and Elon Musk and sending the email out, like, because, actually it was, oh god, who was she? The woman, she was a senator from Georgia, and she just took over the Small Business Administration, and she did a little video. I don't know if you heard
Oh,
about this.
Leffler.
Loeffler,
Yeah,
yes, Loeffler. She's great, and she was walking through the Small Business Administration,
I saw
and
that.
the entire building's empty. She's the only person there, and she's the head of it. And so that reminded me of the Jamie Dimon rant,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
a justifiable rant that here's this
yeah,
guy working 7 days a week. He's the head of JP Morgan. He's been doing it forever. He's created huge amounts of shareholder value. And he was on that call that got recorded about, like, if I'm here, everybody's got to come back to work.
yeah.
And corporate America, I can't believe that, it's not just JP Morgan, but the federal government is way worse. And if they're
Way
not even
worse.
there, how does anything get done?
And he
Even
was
wrong.
able to, what you leave out very discreetly, thank you, was all the F bombs he dropped. But he was appropriately unhinged. This is a job. You need to come into the office. No, by the way, we just built a 90-story building on Fifth Avenue, so I need to fill it up. But let's just quickly break, and then we'll come back and talk about some stocks I want
Corporate
to talk
America.
about. Okay.
Hey everybody, we're back, and this is the micro portion of the segment where my partner Nancy Tengler gets to talk about the five. Oh boy, I forget your.
5 for
I ruined it.
25.
5 on 25. Like, I forgot the punchline again. The 5 on 25. Nancy Tengler.
Uh, I don't know. You're hopeless. It's 5 4 25. I wrote this on
Okay.
December. I think it was December
Check.
25th. Um, it's cocktail hour for Arthur, everyone. So
Might be
he's just
water.
trying to hold it together. Yeah, I wrote a piece at the end of December that just was our 5 for 25, and we pulled the names out of our 12 best ideas portfolio. And I want to preface this by saying, when I wrote the Women's Guide to Successful Investing, the first edition, it was published in 2014, and I was trying to come up with ideas to help people understand asset allocation. And so I was Googling late one night. I might have had a glass of wine or two, but I was Googling and I found my name came up. And it was an interview I gave not to the Wall Street Journal, but to the Wall Street Transcript. And in that interview, I listed 5 names. And so I thought, this is perfect. I'm going to run the portfolio and see how it's done, because it was literally 10 years almost to the day from when I was doing the Google search. So calculated the performance, and what I found was fascinating. So the portfolio dramatically outperformed the S&P. And remember, that included 2008 and 2009 bear market. So it outperformed by over 100 percentage points. It was up something like 280. It's in the book, versus 100 and something for the S&P. But what was really interesting was 3 names underperformed, and one kind of performed in line with the market, and 2 dramatically outperformed. So now if we look at the 5 for 25, and granted, it's only been 6 weeks, 7 weeks, but I thought it was fascinating that 2 of the names have outperformed and 3 have underperformed, but that the entire portfolio again has outperformed the S&P. So many times you'll hear people, or you'll look at your own portfolio and you go, why do I own 80 stocks? You shouldn't. the optimal diversification is 12. And if it was 2012, I would have had 12 for 12, but it's 2025. So we picked the five of my favorite names from our 12 best ideas portfolio. Those names are companies that span sectors, but have a bias towards technology. And the reason for that is that we expect to see some of the stocks are selling off, and clearly the market's selling off on Doge and cost cutting at the government. But based on what we were talking about in the previous segment, Arthur, I think what we're going to see is more government spending as they reduce jobs. We're going to see more government spending on technology. Thank God. So those are reflected in our 12 best ideas, but in particular in the 5 for 25. So it's Amazon is one of the names, Broadcom, which is what I refer to as the poor man's Nvidia. We think that name will continue to outperform Spotify, which has nothing to do with national security, but has everything to do with our happiness as we enjoy music. And then Goldman Sachs, and I always forget one of them. What was the other one? Spotify, Amazon, ServiceNow, which is an important component of the AI revolution, and we think will have continued engagement with the government. So even though it also has commercial business. So these are all of the names that we talked about at the beginning of the year. We want you to continue to watch them. But I also just wanted to say one thing about hedge funds, Arthur, if you don't mind, and then you can ask me whatever you want. But I think this is the group that's called the smart money. But if you go back and look, and I wrote about this in 5 for 25, if you go back and look, they have underperformed the S&P for a very long time, but in particular the last decade. So if you think about that, and that's a gross of fees number. So it's 8 to 10% annualized. Our most conservative strategy, gross of fees annualized over the last 10 years, is up 13%. If you compound that over 10 years, that difference is meaningful. But they're the ones driving the volatility. And I loved, when I was writing this, there were 2 tweets that came out. One was from a hedge fund guy that said, "I'm not good at what I'm doing." I'm not kidding. And then the next one was from another hedge fund guy that said, "I pretty much missed all the major themes in the last 2 years. I was hopelessly out of sync with the market, buying when I should be selling and selling when I should be buying," which just goes to the fact that that's why we have a discipline that's clear and replicable and sustainable. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Was
But
that
the smart money,
or just a random hedge fund person?
I know. It's just, I mean, it was retweeted by the Wall Street Journal. And he goes on to say his mea culpa details how he ignored NVIDIA and Bitcoin and misread tariffs and lost over 35% through November. Last year, the market was up over 20. So that's a pretty big delta if you're paying 2% for that, the privilege of being invested in that fund. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you. So, one of the things that when I think about the economy, Nancy, I look at the 4 kingdoms, right? And you look at tax policy, fiscal policy, trade, and incomes, right? And I know Trump's wants to make the Trump tax cuts from his first term permanent, but he's really looking at cutting taxes going forward. Have you factored in, when you look at some of these stocks, have you factored in the potential to get another round of tax cuts?
Yeah, so we can't, I mean, we are aware of it. So if you calculate, the current corporate tax rate is 22%. Trump wants to bring it down to 15. So let's say he doesn't get 15, 'cause he probably won't, and he gets 18, and that's just an arbitrary number. That just cutting corporate taxes that much would add 4 percentage points to S&P earnings on an annual basis. We won't get the full force of that this year, but markets anticipate and discount, it's a forward discounting mechanism. So I think that's likely to drive the second half, and we'll probably continue to see a choppy first half because we don't yet know about the big beautiful bill and the one big beautiful bill, and we don't know about what regulatory relief is going to come. But you and I face it every day running a small business. I mean, it's onerous. The stuff you have to do. And we saw the benefits during Trump 1.0 when regulations were cut. It's like a tax cut. So I think we'll see that. And then if I could just say one more thing on incomes, and I assume you meant the consumer or no? You mean
I mean incomes policies. So I was talking about
policies?
but
Okay.
but incomes are important, obviously.
Well, it is to me, but yeah. So if you look at the consumer, Walmart came out and reported earnings last week, and they beat dramatically on the fourth quarter earnings, and they gave what was perceived to be tepid guidance for this year. But this is what they do every year. They always give conservative guidance in January, and since they don't know what tariffs are going to be in place, and they don't necessarily know what policy is going to be, and that also includes Fed policy. They're smart to do so. But what they did, and the astute investor should pay attention to this, is they raised the dividend 13%. Now, that's the most they've raised the dividend in a decade. And that tells me that management's pretty optimistic about future earnings growth. And then they gave a whole host of optimistic statements, not the least of which is that 79% of companies, families that make over $100,000 shop at Walmart. That didn't used to be the case. So the high income cohort is really driving share gains or purchasing gains at the company level. And I can attest to that because my Walmart carries Veuve Clicquot champagne. So, that is not your mother's Walmart or your grandmother's Walmart. So it's a pretty high end, and they've upgraded the stores. And what I think and believe is that Target basically handed them the high end customer with all the hoo ha over DEI and the special underwear and I don't know, the scandal
Oh
that
yeah.
drove people out of the store. So anyway, so we're using the volatility again as our friend. At some point, that won't be the case, and it will be time to moderate exposure. But we are in early innings. Last thing I'll say is, we had DeepSeek, and they came out and said they built, an inference model, AI model for 5.6 million, and the market sold off dramatically. I happened to be on CNBC for an hour that day, and happily, I was on with Dan Ives, and so we were able to we agreed that we thought it would increase spending, and that's in fact what's happened. So we had the reports from the hyperscalers, so Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and I'm forgetting the last one, but they not only doubled down in most cases on their capex budgets, but two of them were Amazon and Meta raised their capex budget. So collectively, they're going to spend somewhere between 310 billion and 340 billion in capex this year. This year. So strap in. This is early innings of the AI revolution.
So I have a weird question for you. Traditionally, energy's been thought of as like utility, boring, right? With all of this huge proliferation of chips and chip use and AI and the huge power demands, on top of the fact that we already had, by all accounts, really horrible infrastructure on energy and energy transmission across, and that's not just us, it's everybody. What do you think about the potential for parts of that sector to actually turn around and actually become more of a growth engine than what it's been traditionally?
Yeah, I think it's happening, Arthur. I mean, this is the first time I've owned an electric utility in 35 years.
Wow.
And we were buying some of the infrastructure names. And the electric utilities are not trading on interest rates. They're trading on the potential demand and growth in demand. And we just heard Microsoft come out and say there's power shortage. So, the companies are trying to make direct deals with the source providers of the electricity or have it on prem. And so I think you're going to continue to see that. GE Vernova was a beneficiary of that build out. Quanta Services, which we own, was a beneficiary of that build out. We own some of the nuclear names in our clean energy strategy or nuclear peripheral names. So I think that this will continue. And in some of these electric utilities, we're now expecting to see growth of 10%. Now you got to build out the infrastructure to your point, and that's the right point. But I think it's real and I think it's sustainable because inferencing takes up much more power than just large language models, and that's really what we've been focused on recently. So stay tuned. I think you want to own those names. They got clobbered on DeepSeek Day, and they got clobbered today. But I think that's just because the market is trying to find some equilibrium. And so you use these as opportunities to add. You don't add quickly, you add a little bit at a time. And that's how you build out a portfolio for the long term.
And I'll tell you, if there's anything that's going on the last, I don't know, when January 20th, since January 20th, is that there's a lot of moving parts and it's really hard to figure out kind of where things are
Really
going to
hard.
play out.
Yep, I feel really old. And I felt this way in the first quarter of Trump's last administration. It was like, would you stop? Because it creates so much turmoil. But that is usually an opportunity,
Yeah.
as you know. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for your comments and your
Thank you.
questions. All right. Well, we'll see you all next week.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Macro Mike.